So once upon a time, at the turn of the last century, there was a young girl, a grade school age, at a prestigious school in London who was also causing a bit of a controversy, but this was a different kind of controversy than that of our playground atheist. It seems that Cecilia Payne had won an academic award from a contest in her class, and the prize was to be a book of her choosing. And traditionally, she later recalled, a girl from her social standing, which was upper class, was supposed to choose something by Milton or Shakespeare, because girls from her class were supposed to be interested in literature. Cecilia wanted a textbook on fungus, and no argument to the contrary would dissuade her. So fungus it was to be, and the school found a textbook on fungus and wrapped it in leather and presented it to the budding young scientist. Now, Cecilia's true interests were actually in the stars, and they had been ever since she was 5 years old and saw a falling star while out walking with her mother. She recalls in her autobiography that she decided at just that moment to be an astronomer. And then she writes, "I was seized with panic at the thought that everything might be discovered before I was old enough to begin." In college, as an undergraduate, she was forced to focus on studying plants, hence the fungus, because apparently that is what lady scientists were allowed to study in the 1910s. But she snuck in as many physics classes as she could. She recalls when she first learned that all motion is relative. She didn't sleep for 3 nights. She was so excited. Her advisors, recognizing her gifts, suggested maybe try America. If you enroll in Harvard University, you might get a little bit more freedom. So that is what she did. And true enough, at Harvard, she was finally allowed to study physics and astronomy. In 1925, she became the first person, male or female, to earn a PhD in astronomy from Harvard. Dr. Payne's research focused on the chemical composition of stars, and she demonstrated 2 things. The first, that all of the stars in the universe were made of the same stuff, and the second, that that stuff was mostly hydrogen. And this was a revolutionary discovery. It was so revolutionary that her thesis advisors prevented her from putting in the last part. They said, no one is ever going to believe that. Don't even put it in there. It came out later. And the male professors that were overseeing her remarked that this was the most brilliant thesis that had ever been written in astronomy. The most brilliant thesis. For this, she was rewarded with several decades' worth of poorly paid, low-level positions, as women were not then allowed to be astronomy professors. But Cecilia persisted, and finally in 1956, she became Harvard's first female professor and first faculty chair, and today we know that, yes, the stars are mostly made of hydrogen. Dr. Cecilia Payne called the laboratory her chapel, where she conducted a little worship service of her own every day, she said. She believed that through her devotion to reason and science, her life had been spent, in her words, in direct touch with the fountainhead, whether you call it God or the universe. And her 3 children all attended the religious education program of the First Parish UU Church in Lexington, Massachusetts, where they would have been taught the importance of careful observation, curiosity, critical thinking in developing one's own beliefs, and where they would have been taught respect and appreciation for the wonders of the natural world, and also that women can grow up to be whatever they darn well please. So this month, our worship theme has been roots and connections, and we've been looking at those things that ground us individually and connect us to that which is larger than ourselves. So the Sunday before last, we looked at nature and our place in the web of life, and then last week we honored our personal ancestors. This week I wanted to honor a few ancestors of our Unitarian Universalist tradition by sharing stories of a few inspiring figures from our past. And then I wanted to look at what UU community means for people today by sharing some UU stories from our present. Much of the information for the historical figures comes from harvardsquarelibrary.org, the UUA's Tapestry of Faith program, standingontheSideofLove.org, and then various other supplemental internet research, if you want to go check it out. And contemporary stories come from the books Testimony, The Transformative Power of Unitarian Universalism, and Unitarian Universalists of Color, Stories of Struggle, Courage, Love, and Faith. So let's look at two more historical figures. Lewis Howard Latimer was not born into Cecilia Payne's life of upper-class wealth and privilege. Excuse me. He was born in Massachusetts in 1848 to parents who had escaped from slavery just 6 years earlier by fleeing north. He served in the Union Navy during the Civil War, and after an honorable discharge, he secured an entry-level position at a patent office. There, he taught himself the art of mechanical drawing, and he was so good at it that he was swiftly promoted to be head draftsman for the firm. He caught the eye of Alexander Graham Bell, who put him on the team that was patenting the telephone. And indeed, Latimer worked at breakneck speed over the course of several evenings so that he could submit that application just hours before a competitor got theirs in. But Latimer was not just a draftsman, he was also an inventor. He went on to work with Edison, where he made critical early improvements in the light bulb. It turns out that Edison's only lasted a couple of days because of the filaments that he was using, which is not very effective for a light bulb. But Latimer found another way to encase the filament that extended its life significantly. He was then on the team that implemented electric lighting in major U.S. cities. He's considered a pioneer in the development of electric lighting. He holds 7 patents and is an inductee in the National Inventors Hall of Fame. And Latimer was also a founding member of the Unitarian Church in Flushing, New York. He led singing at the church. He taught drafting and English to immigrants. And he was also involved in civil rights work his entire life. The church survives today as the UU Church of Queens, and every year they give out a science scholarship in Latimer's name to a local African-American high school student who is pursuing the sciences. Now, at about the same time as Lewis Howard Latimer was doing pioneering work in electricity, Florida Ridley was doing pioneering work in journalism. Flora Ridley's father was a lawyer, a judge, and the first African-American to graduate from Harvard. Her mother was a writer and a civil rights activist. And Ridley herself became a teacher, an activist, and a writer in New England. From her biography at the Amistad Research Center of Tulane University, we read, Florida Ridley worked closely with her mother in the Black Women's Club movement. In 1895, she helped organize the first national conference of black women in Boston. An outgrowth of this conference was the formation of the National Federation of Afro-American Women, which later merged with the Colored Women's League to form the National Association of Colored Women. Ridley also founded multiple historical societies devoted to the study and preservation of black history, including black folklore. As a journalist focusing on race relations, most particularly on the evils of lynching, her work was published throughout New England, including in the Boston Globe. She also edited The Women's Era, which was the country's first newspaper published by and for African-American women. As a teacher, being the second African-American teacher in the Boston public school system, Ridley insisted on honoring the multi-ethnic character of American society. It is surprising to find, she wrote, how accepted has been the closing of eyes and ears and minds to the phases of African-American life and character. Florida Ridley and her husband were founding members of the Second Unitarian Church in Brookline, Massachusetts. So in the 3 historical figures selected, Cecilia Payne, Lewis Howard Latimer, and Florida Ripley, we see themes emerge that will appear time and again in our UU history. There is an emphasis on intellectual inquiry and the dogged pursuit of truth, whether that is scientific truth or historical truth or journalistic truth. There is an emphasis on taking action, on living out our ideals, on improving the world. There's an emphasis on fighting injustice and prejudice, on breaking down barriers, and on affirming and celebrating our common humanity. And there is an emphasis on the importance of religious community. Right? Florida Ripley and Lewis Latimer did not just attend UU churches, they founded UU churches. They knew how important it was to have a place to preserve and protect those values and to pass them on to the next generation. So the ideal of freedom and of thought and of conscience is the ideal that probably initially attracts most people to Unitarian Universalism today. In the book, Unitarian Universalists of Color, Stories of Struggle, Courage, Love, and Faith, Christopher Cameron shares his personal experience. He says, around 2013, I was becoming more interested in and involved in the free thought movement. I discovered groups such as African Americans for Humanism and became aware of the strong presence of black freethinkers on blogs. So a major aspect of the UU Church that continues to draw me in is its theological liberalism. I've had conversations, he says, with UUs that span the range from theists to deists to agnostics to humanists, even pantheists. All theological views appear to be welcomed and embraced, and this is what drew me to the church in the first place, he writes. The Reverend Bill Sinkford echoed this sentiment in his own recollection of visiting a UU church at age 14 after deciding that Christianity was not for me, in his words. No hellfire was preached from the pulpit, he writes. A personal search for meaning and a commitment to justice were the message. Even my aggressive atheism at age 14 was acceptable. Not everyone I talked to agreed with me, far from it, but people wanted to hear what was in my heart. I was engaged less in debate and more in conversation in which sharing was possible and perhaps even expected. So as our playground atheists learned in John's story, it's not just about having freedom to think for yourself, but it's having a community to stand by you as you learn to do so. So I want to hold up that right now our 7th through 10th graders here at UUI are going through our coming of age program in religious education, in which they are each paired with an adult mentor who, along with the class leaders and teachers, will help them go through a year-long curriculum of exploring and identifying what they really believe about what's true and what's important, and what are their core truths. And at the end of the process, they are encouraged to share their personal faith statement with the congregation during a special worship service, where their unique take on the world can be celebrated and affirmed. And it's a very powerful experience for our youth to come of age and come into their own in this way, in supportive community that honors their critical reason and their experience. This is one of the ways in which within Unitarian Universalism, intellectual freedom is understood to be one aspect of the larger freedom to be one's true self. We are a religion that affirms each person's humanity, that says to people, you are worthy and you are loved. This is an empowering, healing, even life-saving message that many people hear for the first time in a UU church. And the ongoing spiritual work of our church is to help people hear that message, understand it, and believe it. Maybe even to help ourselves hear that message, understand it, and believe it. The Reverend Bill Sinkford tells this story. He says, a few years ago, I was riding with another minister in a cab in New York City on the way to a meeting in one of our congregations. The driver was a recent Haitian immigrant. What is your business, he asked. After we told him we were Unitarian Universalist ministers, he asked, how does your church feel about lesbian and gay people? We answered with our clear affirmation that all people are children of God, that gay and lesbian folks are welcomed in our congregations and in our ministry. Cabby was silent for a moment, then told the story of his brother, a gay man who had been forced out of his religious home when he was outed in his congregation. Unitarian Universalist, he said, I am glad I have heard of it. We need to find a church where we can be together as a family. I will add that today, on Transgender Day of Remembrance, I want to hold up the importance that our churches do in affirming to transgender people, and most especially transgender youth, that they are beautiful, that they are loved and seen in all of their humanity, and that they are a part of our community. And this is an important space that we create for our youth who do not hear that as often as they deserve to hear it. The message that all people have inherent worth and dignity, our first principle, builds us up within our church community. But when we leave its doors, we are confronted with a world that all too often robs people of their dignity in many ways, including our own dignity from time to time. So we need religious community for our own resilience, to know that it is there for us. At the same time, our religious principles challenge us to be there for other people. This can be as simple as listening with quiet compassion when someone shares their hurt with us, as in the case of the foreman who just gave the gift of his presence, his listening presence to that man who was in severe isolation despite surrounding by people who had known him for decades. Sometimes that is the most powerful gift that we can give. But it can also mean speaking up when we encounter hateful or dehumanizing stereotypes. It can mean using our resources, our time, our talent, our treasure to support organizations that help marginalized people. And if we are people who have a lot of privilege, whatever that privilege may be, it can also be as simple as stepping back, surrendering some of our own power, and letting the voices of those who have less privilege be heard, or making space for people who have not been empowered to lead, to lead. At our best, our tradition calls us to be a force for love in many different ways. There is the love of Cecilia Payne, Dr. Cecilia Payne, which is a passionate love for the universe itself, a deep appreciation for the beauty and mystery that is all around us that called her to peer deeper into that mystery than those before her and to bring new truth into the world. And so great was her love that all the petty and not so petty obstacles of patriarchy pushing back on her for decades could not discourage her. And thus her love opened doors for many other women to follow through. There's the love of Lewis Latimer, which is a self-assurance in one's own ability and worthiness, despite having escaped a situation that sought to dehumanize his family in every way he knew and he trusted in his own gifts. And he expressed this in an outpouring of creative energy that helped transform this nation that was literally a light in the darkness. At the same time, devoting himself to serve those around him in need and fighting for others to be free. And there's the love of Florida Ripley, who shined the light of truth on our country's worst evils when people did not want to face that truth, who helped organize and empower people to be free, and who devoted her entire life to fighting injustice. However love is calling you, in whichever way love is calling you, I invite you to be brave and bold, patient and faithful in answering that call. Religious community means we answer that call not just for ourselves, but for one another. It is the way in which we bring our whole selves to the world and make space for others to do so. It is the way in which we become fully human together. In this season of Thanksgiving, may we be grateful for this tradition that embodies so much love, past and present. May we be grateful for the people, past and present, who have answered that call, and may we answer them with our own faithful response. Blessed be, and amen.